All right. These papers will most likely be returned to you the Monday of the following week, the week following next week, because next Monday is a holiday. It's a university holiday, so you should get them back by Monday of the 10th week, of the 8th week, sorry, approximately. I mean, possibly Friday of next week, but I think it's more likely going to be Monday of week 8. All right. Now, what I want to do today is continue my discussion of Mahmud of Ghazni, and from there move on to a person by the name of Mahmud of Ghor, and then to the Delhi Sultanate, which is going to be a kingdom established in North India. You're probably up to your neck with kingdoms, but when you have a history extending 4,000 or 5,000 years, you're partly going to get something of that. And again, I'm going to try to, rather than giving you, the names of every ruler associated with this Delhi Sultanate over the course of the last 300 years, which is a long list here, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to highlight some of the critical features. And for those of you who were not here on Wednesday, I want to remind you of a very critical point that I'd made, which is that, we have to start thinking once again, about the hazards of simply assuming that we can lump people together into groups called Muslims and Hindus, and then assume that these Muslims and Hindus, were fighting each other, and that's what this history is really about. That's been one way in which this history has been seen, and we have to be aware of some of the hazards of looking at this history in this way. Now, before I show you a few slides, I want to once again set up the scene. So the scene is that you recall that the Arab invasions of India. Okay, so this is India once again, and here you've got Sindh and Multan, which are today in Pakistan. They're no longer in India, right? So after 1947, this part of India became part of Pakistan. And I mentioned to you that in the middle of the 8th century, one view was that essentially India had been saved. North India had been saved, would be, if you want to use that word saved at all, but let's just use it here for the sake of convenience, meaning that it had been saved from Muslim invasions, right? But Sindh and Multan, right, which is where there was an Arab presence now that goes back to already the 7th century, Sindh and Multan, in fact, will be under Arab rule, right? Except that when I said that they're repulsed from North India. So the North India itself will not come under Muslim rule until Mahmud of Ghazni. And if you read, Romila Thapar, who's been assigned to, been given pages from Nehru's work as well. I mean, they essentially talk about what the phrase that has been used by some historians is the Kannauj triangle, right? So Kannauj is over here in North India, in the Gangetic Plains area, right, roughly. And what we are saying is that there is a supremacy, there is a contest for supremacy, right? A war of attrition, I think, would be the best way to characterize it, right? And you've got essentially the Palas here, which is a dynasty in eastern India, right? You've got the Rashtrakutas over here, which is in the western Deccan. You've got the Gurjara Pratiharas, the map that I drawn for you last time, right, over here, right? So you've got these forces are competing with each other. None of them is able to establish their supremacy. Okay, and this is what I mean when I say it's a war of attrition. Down south, you have the Cholas, right? They're not part of this history that we are looking at the moment. Down south over here, in the extreme south, right? Now, a new element comes in, and this is Mahmud of Ghazni, right? And I want to say a little bit more about him, because as I've mentioned to you that, if you had to sort of evoke one figure in the history of Muslim invasions in India who is likely to arouse people to fury, especially Hindus in India, it's Mahmud of Ghazni. Because of the acts that are associated with his name, the sort of pillage that he's supposed to have engaged in, right? And one thing you have to bear in mind is that Mahmud of Ghazni is not interested in establishing an empire in India. I think every historian and commentator agrees on that. Okay, so his court is in Ghazni. Ghazni is in, much further west in Afghanistan. Okay, he himself was a son of a man called Subukiddin, and it's basically in the mid-9th century mid-9th century, you have a Hindu dynasty there in the northwest here, which is called the Shahis. Okay, in this area, right? It's called the Shahi dynasty. And to cut to the chase, to get quickly to Mahmud of Ghazni himself, what we're going to find is that he's going to defeat the principal ruler of this dynasty, who's going to be succeeded by a son. His son's name is Jayapal. This history is, I think, enumerated well in Rumila Thapar, right? And Mahmud of Ghazni, as I said, I've given you a rough figure of about 20 invasions, that there are 20 attacks that he launches on India. So the nature of the attack is you come into India, okay, you loot, plunder, and then you retreat. You take that loot and plunder with you back to Ghazni, where Muhammad has established a fabulous court of intellectuals. Okay, I mean, two of the people who were at this court were Alberuni, and thanks to Alberuni, we have a pretty good account of what was happening in India and how these invasions took place, what was the nature of Hindu society. He leaves behind a very exhaustive account. In fact, we could say that it is the most exhaustive account of India by a foreigner up till this point in time, right? Although the Chinese pilgrims had left behind accounts as well. Two of these Chinese pilgrims I discussed with you, but Alberuni leaves behind an account, and he's a member of the court of Ghazni, so he's a geographer, historian, really well known. There's a book called Alberuni's India, and you can read the text of what he wrote. One of the other great people he assembles in his court is Firdausi, okay? All right? And Firdausi is the author of the Shahnama, the great epic of pre-Islamic Persia, right? So we're speaking about a man who's obviously very cultivated, very enlightened, right? Wants to gather together the brightest minds of the day, builds a huge library. But how does he finance all of this? He loots and plunders. He's not interested in establishing an empire in India. So AD 1004, he's going to attack Multan. I've written that Multan, so this is now, as I said, in Pakistan, in the western, largely, a desert area. But of course, you've got, there's a considerable degree of urbanization. Now, it's very important to mention that Multan was ruled by a Ismaili Shia ruler. It's very important, because if we think of Mahmud of Ghazni as somebody who was animated by a desire to crush only Hindus, well, his invasion of Multan and the way in which he dealt with the ruler of Multan would suggest that we have to alter that picture. Because the account is very clear that he deals with them just as brutally as he deals with any Hindu ruler that he's going to encounter in North India, right? And this is important, because what it helps us do is it helps us move away from trying to understand this simply as a Hindu-Muslim conflict, right? We use these words, and we say that, well, there were Hindus there, and then these Muslims came. But I think it's better to think of them as Central Asians, West Asians, and so on. And especially when we start speaking about people coming from Turkey, which is partly what Mahmud of Ghazni is partly the ancestry is Turkish, and then when we get to Mahmud of Ghor, and when we get to the Delhi Sultanate, we're going to see that the Turkish element is going to increase very substantially over there, right? Then we are saying that to this palimpsest that we have in India, right, where we have had, the Harappans, we have had the Aryans, then we have had various Central Asians coming in. Now we've got people coming in who are of Turkish origin as well, right? That's a way to think of it, not just to think of Mahmud of Ghazni as a Muslim ruler. He is a Muslim ruler, right? And as I said, he's ferociously opposed to idolatry, right? And so the destruction of idols is going to be one of the things that is going to be mentioned in many of these accounts that we have. One account is by Alberuni, but some of the accounts are going to be later accounts, 13th, 14th century. And we're going to understand that we have to understand the rhetorical strategies of many of these accounts. Because when you read these accounts, they'll tell you 50,000 people were killed, 100,000 people were killed. Now, how do you read these numbers? Right? And you have to say to yourself that partly the chronicler is exaggerating the figures to some degree, because it is to the glory of the Muslim ruler when you kill the infidel. Right? So if you've killed 100 infidels, well, you add a 0 at the end, it makes him seem he's a bigger killer of infidels. Right? I'm saying that there's a rhetorical strategy in these texts. These huge numbers that you find, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 people killed. Well, we're not quite sure how, that we should really be reading these that literally. All right? So we are saying, number one, think of the rhetorical strategies of the text. Think of the fact that it is the ruler who is supposed to have done all of this is going to acquire more merit according to the chronicler or historian because he's destroying the infidel. Right? And number three, think of the fact that what is happening here is not simply a conflict that can be represented, as I said, in Hindu-Muslim terms. I mean, I put it to you very colloquially that had there been Citibank and Bank of America at that time over there, that's the first place he would have gone. Well, why does he go to the temples? Now let me show you a couple of slides to try to explain what is happening over here. All right? So let's put this down. While this comes down, let me just give you just a few more details. So AD 1008, okay, Mahmud of Ghazn's 17 invasions, and that's usually the precise number. Sometimes I've seen 16, sometimes I've seen a bit more than that. AD 1008, he comes to North India. So now he's moved further east from Multan, comes to a place called Kangra, which is in present-day Himachal Pradesh. AD 1012, he comes and loots a place called Thanesar, which is very close to Delhi. Very close to Delhi. And in 1018, he's going to plunder Mathura, which is a place associated with the god Krishna. Okay? So, what we're saying is that now he's really entered into the heartland. There was apparently, according to the records, a colossal Krishna temple. And it is said, again, that Mahmud of Ghazni himself, when he had this temple destroyed, thought that it would take 200 years to build a temple of this size, okay, if it were to be constructed in Ghazni, right? Something of this kind, 200 years, right? I mean, so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about these colossal temples and so on, right? Now, I just want to read a little passage from a book over here, which is a history by John Kay, a history of India, where the ruler is going to give a little piece of advice. Okay, so this is written by one of the minor rulers in that area, Hindu rulers. People like him have now been confronting Ghazni for a long period of time. News of Ghazni has been, Mahmud of Ghazni has been spreading, right? And so he writes a little letter saying to another ruler, saying the following: Sultan Muhammad is not like the rulers of Hind. Hind is Hindustan, India. It is obviously advisable to seek safety from such a person, for armies flee from the very name of him and his father. I regard his bridle as much stronger than yours, for he never contents himself with one blow of the sword, nor does his army content itself with one hill out of a whole range. If therefore you design to contend with him, you will suffer, but do as you like, you know best, right? So basically advising him, flee, right? So what we are saying is there's a kind of an aura, right, that has built up. And it's interesting to ask, did Mahmud of Ghazni inaugurate in some ways a new form of total warfare? Right? I'm going to spend a little bit of time on something I haven't done in a few minutes, which is military history, trying to understand why is it that Mahmud of Ghazni is able to repeatedly come into India, right, and go back, come back. Why is it that somebody is not able to repel him finally? Right? We have to understand whether there are some kinds of changes in the technology. But before we do that, one last piece of data as far as the chronology is concerned. And this is the act that, really fires the imagination of people in India. AD 1025, he is going to launch an invasion and attack the temple of Somnath. What you're seeing over here now is the rebuilt temple of Somnath. Okay? In fact, when India acquired independence, this became one of the big projects of the nation state. That was to rebuild this temple of Somnath. Okay, which is today in western Gujarat, right, on the coast. And this is the newly built, renovated temple the supposition that the temple that was destroyed must have looked something like this. All right. Now, to give you an idea of what I'm speaking about, very recently, I don't know if anybody here, at least a few students in this room must have read it. There was a report last year, okay, and I'm giving it to you from the New York Times. Okay, so there's this temple in South India, and they opened the vaults of this temple. They hadn't opened them. The riches that came out of there, if you read the first paragraph, a court-ordered search of vaults beneath the South Indian temple has unearthed gold, jewels, and statues worth an estimated $22 billion. That's one single temple. Okay? These vaults are open. You know, you can read The Guardian. You can read any number of sources. Right? And some people have argued that this estimate is actually quite low because it's all jewels, rubies, diamonds. And you say, well, where are these? Where did this hoard come from? Right? I mean, it would add considerably to the assets of India if every temple obviously had, and we're not saying that every temple has such hidden assets. There may be others that have them. But this is simply to illustrate for you that a temple is where wealth was hoarded. And it was hoarded in the temple because it would receive donations. It would receive donations from the kings, from the princes, aristocratic elite, merchants, right? And some of this would simply be stashed away. All right? And this is, as I said, 2011, when assets are diversified. Well, at that point, assets were not diversified in this particular fashion. Right? So the likelihood would be that you would have huge amounts of these. And that's why when you read these accounts, well, as I said, there's rhetorical exaggeration, but even if you account for the rhetorical exaggeration, the amount of booty, plunder, loot that Mahmud of Ghazni takes back is extraordinary. All right? That's what we're really speaking about. And just to give you a sense, by the way, of the size of these temples that we're talking about, so this is not related, but because we won't have time to look at this again, what we have here is, this is the Meenakshi temple in Madurai, which is in South India, in Tamil Nadu. Right, and what you're seeing here is the lotus pond around which you see these huge gateways. By the way, they're called gopurams. All right, and later on you see this is a close up of one of the gopurams. Not an inch usually would be left uncarved. You would have a sculpture everywhere. Okay, the Meenakshi temple is estimated to have at least 33,000 major pieces of sculpture. Right, okay, and this is again, so now you see the two gopurams, the north and the south, but there would be east and west, and you'll see an aerial view. This is what is called the 1,000-pillared hall. It's actually about 985 pillars, so this is one of the halls inside the Meenakshi temple, right? The temple complex, by the way, 160 acres. I mean, they're absolutely colossal. Okay, we can't really imagine the size of these, and you're not going to find them in North India because in North India temples are going to be largely decimated. And this is, by the way, an aerial view of this temple complex, right? So it's actually got 16 gopurams, then there's smaller ones, and then if you look at the four corners, you're going to find, not the four corners, north, south, east, west, in the middle of that you find one central gopuram, and then you enter the complex, then there's another set of gates, another set of gopurams, and so on, right? And this is the Rameshwaram temple, also in South India, right? Just to give you a little illustration of what we are really talking about when we're speaking about temples. Now, the temples that you find in North India would not have been, this would not have been the architectural style. And as I said, you're not going to find too many in North India surviving from that period of time that we're speaking about, but it gives you some idea of what is involved here. These South Indian temples, we're going to get to this history next week when we look again at South India a bit more closely. These temples, some of them go back to roughly this period of time a little bit later, right? So you're going to have what are called temple cities that are going to develop in South India. All right. So now in 1030, Muhammad is going to die. Mahmud of Ghazni is going to die in 1030. But I want to now look at a number of things related to the military history and the social history of India in an attempt to explain why is it that Mahmud of Ghazni and his eventual successor, if I may put it this way, it's not a line of succession. Mahmud of Ghor is not related to him, so I'm using the succession here very loosely. And in fact, there's going to be a period of 150 years that are going to separate the two. But he's going to be the next great ruler in North India, and what you're going to find is the consolidation of Muslim rule. Between Mahmud of Ghazni, his empire is called the Ghaznavid Empire, which is going to extend through North India now. Mahmud of Ghor is going to have an empire which is going to be that large. Right? And after Mahmud of Ghor, what you're going to find is what is called the Delhi Sultanate, which begins in 1206 and will last until the Mughal Empire begins, right? 1525, 1526. So 320 years. Before we look at that history, let's try to understand what is really happening here. Why is it that Mahmud of Ghazni and Mahmud of Ghor are able to establish their military supremacy? The first thing you have to bear in mind is that in India, war was something in which only a limited number of people could partake because of the caste system. Because remember that the Varnas are associated with occupations. What is the job of a Kshatriya? The job of a Kshatriya is to fight and to rule. Right? The job, Vaishyas are merchants, shopkeepers, traders, so forth and so on. Brahmins are what you would call priests. Now, this is not the case with these people coming from the West, where you have, to the contrary, what we can describe as a kind of military Darwinism, by which I mean it's a survival of the fittest. Many of the people in the army of Mahmud of Ghazni and Mahmud of Ghor are people who are slaves. Now, these people undergo rigorous military training, drilling. If they're not fit enough, they're out. Somebody else will come into their place. The problem for Hindu armies, if I may use that phrase now, is that the fighting is confined to a class of people who are professional fighters. You can't induct everybody else. You can't induct people like peasants and farmers or artisans or traders. Okay? So the training is not that rigorous. The supply is relatively limited. Right? And for many Indian kings, now if you go back to the days of the Mahabharata, one of the things I pointed out to you that, if you read the Mahabharata, it's very clear that, at the end of the battle in the evening, people from opposing sides might even sit down. It's like World War I. There are actually accounts of, generals on opposing sides, the Germans and the French. After a hard day's fighting, you'd get together and, have a couple of glasses of wine together. There are certain codes of chivalry. Now, that's what the Shahi rulers and other Hindu kings are accustomed to. War is really a pastime of kings. That's the worldview they are used to. They are not used to this kind of what I'm calling new form of total warfare that is going to come in with Mahmud of Ghazni and Mahmud of Ghor. Right? That's the real significance of this. It's not simply the coming of Muslims here, right? And we're not saying that it's, and there may be new forms of savagery. If you read the accounts of what happened at Somnath and Robilia Thapar, the pages that you have gives you a very good account. But as she also points out, we'll have to read this with a great deal of circumspection, because this attack on Somnath that took place, it's supposed to have traumatized India forever, Hindu India forever. Right? And if you listen to the statements of some of the Hindu nationalists, the trauma is continuing down to the present day, 1,000 years after the invasion. Well, if it was such a trauma, you would think that there would be some Hindu sources about what had happened at Somnath. There are no Hindu sources at all. It's a little bit like Alexander. There are no sources here. The sources are coming from the Muslim chroniclers, they're coming from Alberuni, they're coming from 13th, 14th century. Okay? Firoz Shah, the Tariqi Firoz Shahi, which is a chronicle of the time of Firoz Shah, which is much later. Right? That's what the sources are. We don't have any Hindu Indian sources here. Now you have, there's going to be the first so-called history that is produced in Hindu India really is going to come from Kashmir, from the north, a little bit later than this. Okay? A little bit later than the period that we're speaking about. So what we're saying here is that if we're trying to understand what is it that enabled somebody like Mahmud of Ghazni and Mahmud of Ghor to be able to create a kind of military triumph in this system. Right, so on the Indian side, you've got the caste system, you've got the separation of rulers from the rural folk. The idea that you would fight to defend your religion is not an idea that really is prevalent in India. And as I said, war is more or less a pastime of rulers. Now, people who are hereditary rulers and warriors are not necessarily good in battle, so Kshatriya is supposed to fight, but a particular Kshatriya may not be inclined to. But that's what they're supposed to do, because that is their Varna, you see. Okay? So these are the distinctions that I think it would be useful for you to keep in mind. Now, there's also a question of military technology. Right? So if you, according to Romila Thapar, I think this account would be widely agreed upon, that Mahmud of Ghor's armies, now they both have cavalry. The Indians have cavalry too. Mahmud of Ghor has cavalry, but his cavalry is a little bit different. The horses are better. They're using horses they've brought from Central Asia, West Asia. Better breed of horses. The army believes in swiftness. The Indian armies, the equipment is lighter. The Indian armies essentially tended to fight in solid phalanxes. So you've got these divisions, and they're grounded to some degree. Okay? And then finally, just so that we don't forget, right? If all these fabulous stories of the fabulous wealth of India, which were obviously in circulation even then, and you recall the quotation from Hegel, which I had mentioned to you in my previous lecture, right? And certainly the accounts that we have from Alberuni and many others of the loot and the plunder and the amount that was taken away, right? Certainly, I think these armies coming from the West would have been inspired. The people in these armies would have been inspired by the thought that, well, there's something to be gained at the end of the day, that this loot and plunder will go not only to the rulers and to the military elites of those armies, but it will filter down to the cavalrymen, the infantrymen, and all of that, right? Okay, and I think we shouldn't underestimate, obviously, as well, the fact that the destruction of the infidel is something that probably weighed on the minds of some of these people, right? So this is giving you a kind of an overarching view of what really happened. Now, to jump ahead a little bit, so as I said, Mahmud of Ghazni dies in 1030, and you're going to get political turmoil for some period of time here. You don't really have a great figure emerging for the next 150, 120 years. Ghazni itself is going to be destroyed in 1151, right? And in 1175, a man called Muhammad of Ghor, right? Ghor is in western Afghanistan. He is going to conquer Multan. He's going to take on the Chalukya rulers in North India in the 1170s, 1180s. And you don't have to worry about all of these dates, just so that we get to the point that we're interested in. 1191, 1192 are going to be two major battles, okay, at a place called Tarain, which is again in North India, right, where he's going to defeat eventually a man called Prithviraj Chauhan. If you go to that area, you'll see the stories about Prithviraj Chauhan throughout, right? He's supposed to be being the last great Hindu ruler there, right, who is supposed to have offered resistance to Muhammad of Ghor with some success initially, but then in 1192 he's going to suffer a crushing defeat. Okay? And Muhammad of Ghor is going to install his slave general, a man by the name of Qutub. Okay? A man by the name of Qutub, he's going to install him as his viceroy in parts of North India. All right? Now, Muhammad of Ghor is himself going to be assassinated. Okay? And the person who's going to become the ruler and is going to establish what is called the Delhi Sultanate. Okay? And I've underlined the word Delhi. I want to say a little bit about that in a moment. Right? So it's Qutubuddin Aibak. I know if anybody here has been to Delhi, you would have gone to what is called the Qutub Minar. I'll show you a couple of slides of this later on in the next class, because this is the great victory tower which still stands, the Qutub Minar, with beautiful calligraphy and everything, dating back to this period after 1206. Okay, so this is a slave dynasty now. Okay, this is a slave dynasty, the Qutubs. And again, remember the ancestry. We're talking about people going west to Afghanistan, some Turkish elements here, right? The Turkish component is going to increase slowly, right? And this is how I think we should think of it, that we've got a new West Asian element being added to this picture, okay, rather than simply thinking of them as Muslims. They are Muslims, there's no question about that, right? And there's going to be very interesting debates in the 13th and 14th century. To what extent are these rulers really ruling as Muslim rulers? Are they following the Sharia or not, for example? Right? There'll be those interesting questions. And there'll be one or two people that we're going to concentrate on, but I just want to give you the overarching view. Now, let's pause for a second to talk about Delhi. Okay? Now, you know, up till this point, Delhi has not really come into our discussion. Delhi, or Delhi as we say in Delhi, right? If you're a Delhi wala, means you're from Delhi, which is how it's said in that city. Now, there is a argument which I think is largely substantiated, that the history of Delhi goes much further back, right? And there are references to places like Indraprasth in the Mahabharata, which is supposed to be Delhi. Okay? What we certainly do know is that we have evidence of settlement in Delhi that goes back a couple of thousand years, right? But it's going to come into recorded history around this time. And this is going to be of central importance, because from this time onwards, the supreme importance of Delhi cannot be underestimated. And we have to understand it partly in a symbolic way, right? That the Delhi Sultanate is going to be established there. It's called a sultanate, so in principle, they're actually getting a writ from the caliph in Baghdad. You know, it's the Abbasid dynasty there, okay? To represent the caliph. So the Sultan of Delhi is literally a representative, okay, of the caliph in Baghdad. But that doesn't mean that he's paying him tribute. He's not paying him tribute or anything. And these rulers are autonomous, okay? They're completely autonomous, and this Delhi Sultanate, as I said, which is going to be comprised of a number of dynasties, ruling dynasties, is going to be around for 320 years, okay? The significance of Delhi, which I was talking to you about, is A, that it's now going to become a major player in the political history of North India and subsequently all of India, right? So we're going to find that the Mughal emperors are going to have Delhi, Fatehpur Sikri, Agra. These are going to be, well, Fatehpur Sikri for a very short period of time. It's going to be abandoned actually, but Agra and Delhi are going to be the major strongholds of the Mughal Empire. And when the British are going to install themselves, initially it's not going to be Delhi. They're going to be based in, their capital in the 19th century will be Calcutta. But then in the early part of the 20th century, the British come to the realization that if you want to, in some ways, be viewed as the legitimate rulers of India, you have to shift your capital back to Delhi. There were many reasons why they shifted their capital. I'm going ahead in the chronology again here because I'm trying to underscore the importance of the city of Delhi, right? But in the early 20th century, the British are going to make an announcement in 1911 that they're going to shift their capital from Calcutta to Delhi, and they are going to construct a new capital, which is called New Delhi. You know, some of you might have wondered what's the difference between New Delhi and Delhi. That's the difference. New Delhi is technically, you know, the capital that was going to be built by the British, right? So why would they want to do that? And to understand that, that's what it means to go back to the history of the Delhi Sultanate. That is the supreme importance of the city, right? And you mark your presence by a grand capital, right? So there have been many capitals that have been built in Delhi repeatedly. You know, one capital is built, another capital is built, There are very few cities in the world, by the way, which have that kind of layers and layers of monuments and archaeological deposit as Delhi does. Right? So you go back to this history, you have to go back to the Delhi Sultanate. All right? Now, the Delhi Sultanate has a number of, as I said, a number of dynasties. So what we have here is Qutb-ud-Din Aibak establishing the first dynasty, 1206 to 1286. And I'm not really going to say much about it, because the way to understand it is to simply understand that there is a consolidation of power in North India. But I'm interested here for a moment in how historians have written about it, right? And this is where we get back to the question of representation, how we write history, the nature of Orientalism, and all of that. Qutb is going to be succeeded by a man called Iltutmish, and he's going to be succeeded by a woman by the name of Razia Sultana. Quite a legendary figure. She has a very short period of rule, and I just want to give you a little idea of how her rule has been represented. This is from a book called The History of India. This is a reprint by Mountstuart Elphinstone. This book was originally published in the 1830s, so this is a much later reprint. The book is almost 200 years old. It's a huge 2-volume history. Elphinstone was the governor of Bombay. One of the things I find interesting in British historiography of India is how many of these works were written by people who were actually administering India. So we can use a phrase, scholar-administrator types. It tells you a little bit about their learning too. I mean, can you imagine George Bush writing a history of anything, right? I mean, right, assuming that he had any levels of literacy at all, right? I mean, and that's very much the case. You know, or Ronald Reagan writing a history of something or the other. You would need a ghostwriter, you know, to do that, right? But these people, they're voluminous writers. Voluminous writers, okay? And now this is what he says. Read a few passages and let's interpret them a little bit, okay? Razia Begum says Farishta. He's quoting Farishta, who's a much later historian, compiler, okay? 1700s. Was endowed with every princely virtue. She only ruled for 3 years. And those who scrutinize her actions most severely will find her in no fault except that she was a woman. That's her great fault, she was a woman. But no other great fault except that, right? Right? I mean, of course, it's self-evident that, you know, words that we use called racism, sexism, etc., that's all part of the discourse. That's par for the course. So let's not even get too, you know, surprised by any of that, okay? Now, let's go further down that paragraph. But the queen's arts were more effectual than her arms. So she is a queen. So she uses cunning because she doesn't have the physical strength, right? The queen's arts were more effectual than her arms. She succeeded so well in sowing dissensions among her enemies that the whole confederacy dissolved and left the individuals composing it at her mercy. Some were put to death and others conciliated. And this is very important, you see, because what he's trying to show is the brutality of the times, right? And some of it, by the way, I think is accurate. I don't think we should say that, all of this is rhetorical exaggeration, because frankly, in European history, it's not much better. I mean, if you look at the history of the Tudors and the Stuarts in England, you would have a very good idea what I mean, right? Where members of the family are being sent to the tower, you know, to the block where your head would get chopped off, right? Some were put to death and others conciliated, and in a short time, quiet was perfectly restored. The internal administration of Razia did not fall short of her political address. She appeared daily on her throne in the usual habit of a sultan, gave audience to all comers, reformed the abuses which had crept in under the last government, revised the laws, decided suits of importance, and evinced all the qualities of a just and able sovereign. So now this seems to be a fairly balanced view over here, that, you know, she is attentive to her subjects and rules her kingdom with a firm hand, but justly. But her talents and virtues were insufficient to protect her from the effects of a single weakness. It was shown in the extraordinary marks of favor which she showered on her master of the horse. Okay? In plain English, she fell for a man, and which she shouldn't have, right? Who, to make her partiality more degrading, was an Abyssinian slave. So she fell in love with an Abyssinian slave. It does not appear that her fondness was criminal, since the greatest breach of decorum alleged against her in her allowing the Abyssinian to lift her on her horse. It was, however, imprudent in the highest degree, for by raising her favorite to the office of Amir al-Umra, which means the commander of commanders, the highest rank, which gave him rank over all other courtiers, she at once disgusted her nobility and furnished them with plausible ground for exciting a clamor against her. Right? So she falls in love with this Abyssinian slave and then raises him to the highest rank, and obviously everybody is disgruntled, and we know what's going to happen to her. She's going to be assassinated, right? This is the lot of all of these rulers, right? If you read Elphinstone's history, it's one large record of murder and assassination that's occurring in India. Okay? Now, the Qutubs are going to be succeeded by a group of people known as the Khaljis. So that's a second dynasty in the Delhi Sultanate. There are several dynasties here. The Qutubs are the first, then we've got the Khaljis. Short-lived dynasty, 1290 to 1320. And I want to spend a few minutes on one figure here, important figure, Allaudin Khilji. Okay, Allaudin Khilji, and a person whose reforms and interventions are actually quite critical for understanding the history of India at this juncture and later on as well. He reigns from 1296 to 1316, 20-year reign. Is known for a number of different things. A, he invades South India, and there are quite a few accounts there, accounts from his own times and by subsequent Muslim historians 50, 100 years later. He invades South India, number one, right? Number two, he's going to defend India against the Mongols. One thing I haven't mentioned to you, 1206, which is the year that the Delhi Sultanate gets established, is also the year when Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan, right, is going to be able to put all the Mongols tribes together in a confederacy, and is going to, as the popular accounts put it, lay large parts of territory that are going to come under his sway to waste, right? The sacking of Baghdad, so forth and so on, all of these stories, right? I mean, one of the most ferocious rulers in the world, etc., etc. We're not particularly interested in his history at this juncture. What we are interested in is the fact that the Mongols are not going to be able to take over India. That's quite significant for a country that's constantly falling under foreign rule, and much of the rest of Europe and Asia is going to come under Mongol rule. India itself is going to be able to repel the Mongol ruler, right? And these Mongol invasions are going to continue in India over a period of time. They're going to last for decades, right? Allaudin Khilji is going to decisively repel the Mongol invaders. So we're talking about a very considerable army that he had, obviously, right? So one, as I said, he extends his rule down into South India, is able to defend India against the Mongols, right? And there's the story that is told of him in some of the Muslim chronicles is that the heads of the vanquished Mongols were put in a pyramid, and this pyramid was erected at the gates of Delhi, right? So that passers-by could see, what he had done to the Mongols and the extent of his bravery, so forth and so on, right? I'm going to continue with the history of Allaudin in my next lecture. Because we do need to spend a little bit of time on him. He's actually a major figure for reasons that will become apparent to you later on.